Alright, let's talk about dopamine. When you hear dopamine, it's commonly associated with the reward system in your brain. However, dopamine is working long before you crave something and long after you've consumed it. The functions we associate with dopamine are from the routes through the brain, called circuits, that dopamine is sent through. How does the dopamine know where to go? Well, the dopamine is sent to the prefrontal cortex, which is the frontmost part of the brain, and the prefrontal cortex uses dopamine to ensure actions. It essentially decides where that dopamine should be sent and then fires it to that place. The prefrontal cortex can fire dopamine through many circuits, such as simple movement circuits, but can also be fired through other more complicated circuits. In this video, I'm going to focus more on the latter. More specifically, the circuit referred to as the mesocortical circuit, which is essentially responsible for decision-making on what to do and what not to do. Before we discuss dopamine in a specific example, I'd like to use an analogy to help further the understanding of how dopamine really works. So, if you can imagine a wave pool, there's quite a lot of water in this wave pool. And as it creates waves, the water goes up and the water comes down. Dopamine works in a similar way. As your prefrontal cortex sends out dopamine, it's what's called a spike, which is the top of the wave. And then after that, it comes down and dips below the baseline, which would be the total amount of water in the wave pool. Think of how a wave has a peak and a wave has a bottom. Pretty straightforward, right? So now that we've discussed dopamine and its functions, let's talk about it in a specific example. For the sake of simplicity, our example is going to consist of 3 phases. The first phase is going to be the initial desire for something. When you first desire something, your brain releases a surge of dopamine, thus making you desire said thing. The drive to obtain that substance, however, is a result of the downward spiral from the top of that craving spike. You see, the dopamine drops below the average baseline in order to convince you to do something. This is contrary to the popular belief that dopamine is simply a post-action reward substance. Now, upon experiencing this craving spike, we reach phase 2, the decision. This phase is essentially comprised of 2 decisions. We can either A, take part in the desired action, or B, not. Phase 3 is the reaction based on your decision. If you were to take part in the desired action, then your brain would once again release dopamine. The release of dopamine here, however, is different from the initial craving spike in phase 1. If the desired outcomes meet the expectations of the original dopamine spike, then you will experience another spike in dopamine. If it is subpar, then your brain will return to its baseline or stable state. This process of your brain analyzing the expectation versus reality is referred to as reward prediction error, or RPE for short. Now, what if you chose not to do the action your brain suggested? Well, if you chose not to take the action, your dopamine would slowly rise from below baseline and then settle at its stable state. But this level of dopamine is very important. But why should it be important to you? To understand how this can be useful for you, I'd like to revisit the wave pool analogy. You see, as we go about our days, dopamine is constantly going up and down, as it should. However, something to keep in mind is that our reservoir of essentially our daily levels of dopamine is limited. And with too large and frequent peaks, some of that wave can cause a loss of dopamine from the reservoir due to the sheer size of the peak. This is essentially like a big monster wave in the wave pool, coming in and splashing, and quite a lot of water goes out and into some drains. This is where the concept of delayed gratification becomes scientific. You see, back in phase 2, after the initial craving spike of dopamine, if you were to choose not to take part in the desired action, then your dopamine would simply return to baseline. However, since you didn't incite another spike by doing your desired action, then you essentially saved your dopamine for later and allowed your reservoir to remain more constant. Now, of course, the concept of delayed gratification should not be applied to the extreme, especially when your body is at risk. However, it can be applied to simple actions, especially when it comes to, for instance, trying to drop a bad habit or maybe say no to eating another chocolate bar. I hope with this information, you can now understand the works, effects, and processes of dopamine so you can better go about living your life.